Welcome to Recross the Paths. I'm Cade, and my guest today is Jabs. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hey, thanks. I'm really excited to do this.
So, Jabs curates, among other things, Modern Darlings as a cube, and I'm thrilled that we get to unpack this. But I want to start before we get there, back at the very beginning. How did you find your way into magic, Jabs?
Around 10 years old, my aunt and her friends bought some boxes of Odyssey and Scourge, and they gave me their bulk, which was amazing as a young kid getting handed like hundreds of cards.
Especially cards from that era.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't really appreciate it at the time, but I still have a lot of those commons and uncommons still because I don't know, I like bulk. And being my first cards, very sentimental. After that, I didn't really play for a while, but kind of got back into it really officially with Return to Ravnica.
That's quite the gap between Odyssey and Return to Ravnica.
Yeah, I had that seventh edition like disc that came with Magic Online, but I didn't realize it was Magic Online. Played that a little bit. Played the Duels of the Planeswalkers games a little bit. Finally found like an LGS just before Return to Ravnica was released. We did an Innistrad send off draft. I opened a Snapcaster Mage. And then the next weekend, I opened a Sphinx's Revelation in the pre-release, and I've just been hooked on Control since.
Oh man, that's got to be like such a foundational way to begin, or to resume, I should say.
Yeah, it definitely was. Yeah, I mean, I went from as a kid really liking elves and like, oh, this elf is so cool, and then oh wait, I can board wipe and counter things.
And make the elves player sad.
Yeah, although I have always had a love of slivers, and that has always stayed around.
So then, with magic in your background, how did you find your way to Cube?
So originally, Cube specifically, I found through Magic Online. I played a lot of Magic in paper in that time frame after I got back into it after Return to Ravnica. I won New York State champs, which was sealed with the top eight draft. I think it was Triple Theros, but my deck was like Stormbreath Dragon and Xenagos Planeswalker and Bow of Nylea.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was very good. And after that, yeah, I was big into constructed, mostly control again, standard like Esper control, modern, like blue white red, or what a lot of people called USA back then. Went to a bunch of Grand Prix with friends. A lot of us played different decks, so it got me to kind of branch out a little bit from control decks. And then our local scene changed, and people went off to college, and we didn't have as many modern players, and some of my friends sold their collections, and we still all wanted a way to hang out and play and keep in touch. So I offered up Cube as an idea, and we just went with it.
So did that look like playing mostly online? Was that still meeting in person?
No, still meeting in person at the time, and then as you know, as we've all grown older, I've since moved away, but still we'll go back and visit family and bring the Cube up, and we try to organize a way for us to all get together. Although as time's gone on, it's gotten harder and harder, but that's life, right?
That happens to all of us, yes. So was Modern Darlings part of that process, or is that something that came afterward?
It actually wasn't intentionally part of the process, but yes, it was part of the process. So, Modern Darlings is a very weird name, right? Like, people probably hear it and don't really get it. Right? Like, I'm sure, like, some people just like, yeah, what Modern Darlings? Okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's not like the most out there cube name, but it is something that begs some questions at the front end.
yeah, so it refers to the phrase to kill your darlings, which is most often used in storytelling or writing. And it means to like remove elements that as the creator you might personally love but they don't serve the overall narrative very well. So for my initial cube ideas with my friend group, I had to balance like a lot of newer cards that I absolutely wanted to play with these people that haven't followed Magic in a couple years. And so it was kind of like, okay, these cards are 5 years old and these cards are brand new. And when we're talking about sets that were released like Modern Horizons 1 and 2, there was a big power gap change there.
Oh yeah.
And modern as a whole drastically changed, but we all loved modern. That's all what we used to play together. And a lot of other people I saw online were also missing old modern, if you will. And it all kind of clicked for me that I didn't really have to kill my darlings. I got to just get rid of the new cards because none of my other friends were keeping up with the current sets. So I got to embrace the old darlings that weren't really able to keep up in this new Modern Horizons world.
I love that principle as a way to start. It's like, we hear different people say that at different times about, well, cube can just be the cards you want. But when you can approach it from a broad stance of a format or an era that you can hold on to, that's really powerful.
Yeah, it was definitely easier to have everyone have these cards that they already recognized. We had tried to have like the typical sort of vintage like cube, and with all the new cards that had been printed in that time frame since a lot of my friends last played, it was mostly just like, oh, what's this card with 300 words do? Oh, okay. We realized like it wasn't fun if we were all just sitting there reading all the time. People were misunderstanding things, and these are guys that went to Grand Prix, and a couple of them played on the Pro Tour. Like real players that were really experienced, and you still just it got too wordy with the newer cards.
So, to make sure we have proper context as we continue to talk about this project, give us an elevator pitch for Modern Darlings. What should players expect?
So Modern Darlings is definitely designed to be a time capsule. It's not 100% of a strict rule, but that was what I was going for. Basically, pre-fire magic, the fire capital FIRE, which was a design philosophy from Wizards for a little bit.
It was designed to try to make cards and packs more accessible at a glance, as I recall, kind of reducing complexity on the whole.
Yeah, fun, replayable, things of that nature was what they were going for. And I really wanted to try to stick with, for Modern Darlings specifically, I wanted to stick with cards that we were used to and things that felt similar to what we were used to. So basically, I went up to about Origins as the stopping point. There are some cards that came after Origins that are here, but not a ton. And didn't really include the modern ban list. If it's seen play in modern, I found it fair game here.
And Origin seems like a fair cutoff point too. I mean, we've passed the like M15 border change. You have a number of things that were core to that experience, but as somebody who played around that time, I appreciate Origins as as kind of a decent cutoff point for that experience.
Yeah, and as we look at like constructed, we kind of all felt like around that time frame was when the next format after modern was going to be, and that's kind of what we see with Pioneer. It's around that cutoff.
So you have included in this cube a number of newer cards beyond that cutoff, as you noted, things like Stern Scolding, maybe Shadow Summoning, All That Glitters. How do you choose which new cards to break that rule?
So I really wanted cards that felt like they could have been printed in that time frame of pre 2015, or cards that were basically a duplicate effect. Stern Scolding feels a lot like Spell Snare at first glance. Now, they don't hit everything the same, but they're similar, right? Shadow Summoning and basically any token maker from Black White Tokens. All That Glitters and Ethereal Armor are pretty comparable. Thought Monitor and Thoughtcast is another one that's pretty comparable. Not necessarily always exact duplicates for the exact cost, but things that felt very similar.
As you're looking at new cards, as new sets come out, are you looking for analogs like that, like things that may add redundancy to certain archetypes?
Oh, absolutely. I'm actually a little overexcited about Bolt Wave being a Lava Spike duplicate, just because it's like one of those things where, you have only so many Lava Spikes available to you in a cube. And any ones that, like Lightning Bolt, that can actually hit a creature are normally going to be scooped up by other decks. So, yeah, I'm excited about Bolt Wave. And I'm always on the lookout, although with the new sets, it's hard because I really don't expect to find much for this cube.
Have you found that your players respond well to the newer cards even without the prior familiarity that you were talking about?
Yeah, because like I said, I really wanted to aim for any new cards feeling a lot like effects that we already had. So people see like something like Thought Monitor and they go, "Oh, this is Thoughtcast as a creature." So there's always that jumping off point. So it tends to be go over smoother than not.
One of the other things you noted there in your overview is that you've included a couple cards that have been banned at different times in modern or other formats. Thinking things like Deathrite Shaman, Gataxian Probe, or the Delve spells from cons like the Dig Through Time or Treasure Cruise. Talk about that choice.
Yeah, so Modern's ban list has been a little bit all over the place. So we've had cards come on and off and on and off. And so at the time when Modern was created, there were some cards that were viewed as too powerful, some that started on the ban list right away, like Bitter Blossom and Stoneforge Mystic, and then other cards that were added after that that was viewed to be too powerful in the context of what the format was, like Wild and the Cattle. And then those cards really aren't that busted as you print more and more sets. And then there are some cards, like you mentioned, the Deathrite Shamans, the Probes, the Treasure Cruises. Those cards are incredibly efficient, incredibly powerful. They're going to stand out basically anywhere. Now, I tried to have a reasonably tight power band on this. However, there are some cards that will always stick out. I haven't had a problem yet come up with something like Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, but I would end up removing any cards that would end up being shown to be too powerful. However, I feel like another thing that kind of keeps these cards in check is that there's only one of them,
Yeah, I was about to ask about that exactly. Yeah.
so that does tend to help.
Yeah, you think about so many of these decks in their heyday in modern or like Deathrite Shaman and something like Legacy, where you have the redundancy, where you know you can get multiples of these, or you're getting multiple activations in those cases, or Gataxian Probe helping out decks like Infect. So just having one, does that make it feel? Does it feel more like a power piece, or is it just like a just an extra part of this environment?
They really kind of feel more like an extra part in my mind. Like, if Infect has the probe to know if the coast is clear, great. But there might also be somebody else that scooped up the probe. One thing I found which definitely makes Birthing Pod look very reasonable is that it's not always coming down on turn two. Because that's what would happen back in the day. Is
Yeah.
every time it was turn two. And that's when you couldn't really interact with it. We also had less removal spells, like Fatal Push wasn't in existence yet. So, really the busted cards, the banned cards, things like that, they're definitely held in check by some of these newer printings and just being limited to one copy.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a helpful segue there, thinking about particular decks that you would want to capture from modern, looking at things like Birthing Pod, maybe like Splinter Twin. Talk about the role of combo in modern darlings.
Yeah, I think combo is very good here. I think you just have to be willing to take your combo pieces aggressively. A lot of people think like with a typical cube, they go, oh, "Okay, I'm gonna like pick a fetch land first pick." Whereas in this cube, if you see Splinter Twin or you see Birthing Pod or a combo piece like that, I would say you should snatch it up as soon as possible. Part of what makes two card combos or sometimes with like pod, three card combos work really well here is that the entire cube is being drafted every time. So you don't have these cards that, oh, I might see this, I might not. It's just a matter of, well, did somebody else draft it or not?
Yeah, there's no chance of like Splinter Twin is not going to be here. So if you see the Pestermite, you know that there's a chance the other's there.
Right. It's not a 540 card cube, so yeah, sure, somebody else could have taken your twin, but at the same time, if you take the Pestermite or vice versa, at least the other person isn't getting both pieces, so it kind of works out either way.
I know combo can be a bit of a polarizing experience for some players or drafters. Is that something that you feel is integral to the modern experience?
Yeah, I really do think that. I think a lot of what this era of modern was, for better or worse, was kind of like two ships passing in the night. And you have Infect, which wanted to win on like turn two. You have Birthing Pod, which wanted to win on like maybe turn three or four, or Twin turn four, really. And so combo, I feel like, really was a big part of this modern era. And it's really important to be able to capture what the feel was to me.
So with the cube being largely singleton, and we'll unpack that in just a second too, how have you approached designing for archetypes that have more specific density needs like affinity or infect, for example?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges in a cube like this is that you want cards that can fit into multiple decks, not just one deck, because then it's kind of a bust. Now, you're not really going to be able to avoid that every time. Like Mox Opal is really only going to go in affinity,
Right.
but sometimes you need the Mox Opals to make that archetype work. So for affinity, there are a lot of standout affinity specific cards. However, there are also some that you could get away with playing in like a typical zoo like deck, or engineered explosives is an artifact, but it also is useful elsewhere. Basically, everyone wants to play Mishra's Bauble, you
Yeah.
know, things like that.
Another one of those ubiquitous zero spells that find their way, like Gataxian Probe used to.
Right, exactly. Things like that. And for Infect, I looked at the spells that were being played at the time, basically, was my biggest thing. I wanted this to be almost entirely cards that were played. And if I had to dig into the weeds a little bit on MTG Top 8, I did. There are some interesting removal spells here overall. But but for Affinity, I really wanted to find cards that could overlap with like Zoo or Hexproof, something like that, so that maybe if you just ended up picking up a bunch of pump pieces, but you weren't sure which way you were going to go with it until later on, oh, okay, all these creatures have Hexproof, or all these creatures have Infect, or all these creatures are just statted well for their cost.
Does it feel like the decks that you end up with still capture the feel you're going for, like to try to emulate those modern deck experiences?
Oh, yeah. I had the pleasure of being able to review when this was featured in CubeCon 2023, and I got to see decks, I got to see pools. And every once in a while, you'd have somebody that kind of had a little bit of a train wreck, but a lot of the times it's like, okay, I know exactly what this person was going for here. And sure, like maybe there's a couple cards that stand out as not optimal or not ideal, but if the majority of the deck was basically a constructed deck, that's what I wanted people to have.
You've chosen to selectively break Singleton for a couple of cards, primarily in your land section, but in a couple other spots. What would lead you to make those kind of duplicates with Singleton and the rest of the cube?
So I really like the challenge of designing a singleton cube. I know people are hit or miss on it. I just didn't want it to get in the way of having a better design or better gameplay. So having like two of each fetch land, three of each shock land, that helps people not only be able to cast their spells, but also makes your mana base feel like you're playing a modern constructed deck. So that was one big thing for me. The other thing too is if there was a duplicate like effect with a differently named card, I tried to go with that. But there is not another Valakut. It's
Yeah,
the only one, right? Valakut is Valakut. There is no other type of effect like it.
perhaps a great mercy that there is not a lot of redundancy for Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle.
Right. However, I wanted to avoid someone drafting their entire deck based around getting a Valakut and then somebody else going, I'm going to hate draft this. I don't want to lose to that deck. So I included the second one because, like we just said, there's not another effect like it. Whether you're casting Scape Shift or Primeval Titan or just playing lands, you need Valakut for that archetype.
Have you considered doing that kind of duplication for other archetypes in the cube?
A little bit, yeah. Kind of in a unique way, though, not just straight up adding another draftable, regularly draftable, I should say, copy of a card. So I have this idea that I've run past a couple people, Bones included. Bones is a wonderful resource, by the way, a wonderful person.
I tend to agree.
And so the idea that I've kind of come to settle on, that disclaimer needs to be tested a lot more because it might entirely break this cube. It might work out well. But the idea is that there are 16 cards in a singular pack that are drafted separately from your regular packs. And those 16 cards hopefully look something like a generic white card, like Path to Exile, a generic blue card, like maybe Mana Leak, generic black card, like Thoughtseize, cards that want to go everywhere, right? Lightning Bolt, something like that. Birds of Paradise probably would fit most green decks. It's going to go in Valaka, it's going to go in Birth and Pod. Might not go in Zoo, but it should go into a variety of decks. And then maybe like a City of Brass, for example, as a land. Not 100% sold on the land, but a wide array there. And then get into the rest of the cards, like the 10 or 11 remainers for that pack, being really, really archetype specific. Things that you absolutely want a copy of: Birthing Pod, Splinter Twin, another hexproof one drop, whether that's Glade Cover Scout, Slippery Bowl, whatever. The second Valakut could go here, for example. A Mox Opal or Arcbound Ravager, or something like that. So this pack is made up of 16 cards. So everyone drafts their first pack regularly. Then, since there's 8 people in the draft, one at a time, everyone takes a card from this special pack. And the idea of this is so that you kind of know where you're going after your first pack, and you go, cool, I'm looking for a very specific card to help make my deck. So after the first pack, you draft this, and then the pack stays at C8, which is 8 remaining cards left. It doesn't go around the table twice yet, it only goes around once. Then you draft pack 2, and all good. You found your other pieces that you need for your deck. It's really starting to come together, but you might still be missing that one thing, or this could be where you take one of those more generic cards, I should say, that will fit anywhere in case you have more of like a control deck or more of a mid range deck. And that's when the remaining 8 cards get drafted, but they snake back from 8 to 1 instead of 1 to 8 like they did originally. So the idea is basically increased power, increased consistency, increased namesake cards, Birthing Pod, affinity type cards, twin, stuff like that.
That's really interesting. So you'd be taking like a single Rochester pack and putting it between your sets of packs there to try to fill in the gaps there. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I don't know, it might create some feel bads if you're not seat 1 or seat 8 or whatever, but everyone has a different philosophy to how they want to draft when they know their seat number. And it's something that you'd know beforehand, at least. So you know, like, all right, if I'm getting a certain type of card passed to me, then I know that this should be open in that special pack. And the idea is to just increase consistency for you. The players that want to play this type of cube, right? The players that really want to feel like they're playing modern constructed decks, they don't want to play their combo one time in 3 rounds. So the idea is adding an additional piece for them is going to make everyone have a better playing experience if they're on the right side of it.
Well, I like that a lot, Jabs, and I think there's a lot of space to take an idea like this and try to apply it in other ways too, just as a small injection of critical pieces into an environment.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot of merit to it. I'm not sure. Like I said, it could end up absolutely just breaking this cube and being way too powerful here, specifically because there are a lot of combos. But we'll see.
Wanted to take one quick check here on your lands. You have over 20% of your lands as fixing. You mentioned this is partially to capture that feel of modern, like a high density of fixing. How have you found that's worked for you so far?
Yeah, so right now, as it stands, the current list on Cube Cobra at 360 cards, sometimes it feels like you might be one playable short, which is why I kind of came up with that previously mentioned idea. Because sometimes you might just have a lot of lands if you take them aggressively, and you might be actual short playables. But a lot of the non fetches, non shocks, there's a big reason for them. They're very specifically chosen. Like Celestial Colonnade is very important to control.
Oh, yeah. Creeping Tar Pit has ended many
Yeah,
games.
right, right. So these lands from Zendikar that you can animate and beat face with, that's one thing that's super helpful. The other thing too is you have the affinity artifact lands. That's going to
Yeah.
help you turn on your Mox Opals on turn two, right? Something like that, maybe even turn one. You have some of these lands that fix, like Mana Confluence and City of Brass. Some of these lands do a little bit more, like Desolate Lighthouse or Gavany Township. So it all wasn't necessarily intentional to have a nice even 75, but it just happened to work out that way.
And another thing, just since I always feel it's worth highlighting as an encouragement to those who don't, you don't seem particularly beholden to spreadsheet aesthetics or making sure that the numbers balance exactly color to color.
So here, no, I am not beholden to that because I wanted it to be basically, like we talked about, constructed decks. And so, yeah, you have a little bit better mana for five pairs than the other five because at the time, the fast lands for Izzet, Orzhov, Golgari, Boros, Simic didn't exist yet.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I'm going to make a cube as even as possible. There is 50 cards of one color, there are 50 cards of all colors. But here, that's not the case because it's just not how the decks were built then.
That's so interesting. I think it is funny that the one we've chosen to highlight here is like, this doesn't follow your usual sensibilities, but rest assured, otherwise these will be even across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of myself as not very creative, but very analytical. You kind of see that a little bit here, both sides of that, because I had to get a little creative to avoid a lot of duplicates. But on the other hand, I had to be very analytical and say, like, okay, these cards were cards that played well in this era and actually all go well together here.
In that spirit, do you have a favorite non-traditional inclusion in a modern cube? I was looking through seeing things like Flames of the Blood Hand I've not seen in other projects recently.
So like Flames was the burn card before Skullcrack was printed,
Right.
and
Yeah, that's fair.
a lot of these cards were, like I said, I had to go deep on some of these. If I had to cheat a little bit and say a card that I really like but might not be a typical inclusion, I think like something like Psy because it works so well here. If
Yeah.
you're affinity, but it's not the typical aggro affinity that we saw. It allows kind of that bridge the gap between like the aggro or the slower control type affinity decks.
And we're certainly not getting so far as to like Urza Lord High Artificer, but it's capturing some of the feel of the kind of a mid-range affinity that didn't quite exist then.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes Affinity had to like, sideboard in their edge champions and things of that nature. And so this kind of gives a similar game plan to that. But also allowing you to cast your spells and because you're getting another token, you're kind of like double discounting your affinity spells.
Oh yeah. And you've also included Etch Champion here, so
Hmm.
protection from all colors still alive and well.
Yeah, there were some cards that I had to stick away from. Like, I felt like Thrun could be too good, given regeneration and given can't be countered, hexproof. Like, I didn't want people just to take generic good cards like Thrun. I wanted Thrun to be Jun's sideboard, for that control matchup.
So you can draft Thrun, but he has to stay in your sideboard.
Well, I excluded Thrun because I felt like it's just going to be good for a lot of different things. Which, to be fair, yeah, but it's not typically a card that you might think would be busted in any sort of normal environment. But Edge Champion gets the nod because it was just such an iconic card for Affinity back in the day, especially as a control player. People sided those in. If your Edge Champion landed, you were scared as the control player.
Oh yeah, you were wrath or bust at that point.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So you mentioned that you think of Modern Darlings as sort of a time capsule. Is this a project that you think could reach a finished state, or do you plan to keep iterating on it?
You know, I think it's fair to say that it's not ever going to be entirely finished, but a lot of the cards do feel pretty locked in. There are some cards that might not be ideal that might be replaced. I've also tinkered with removing like even entire archetype like black white tokens and using those slots to boost the density of the other archetypes. Black white token specifically gets the axe here if it were to happen for a couple of reasons. It seems to be like the least desirable archetype for people. Like they kind of just been like, oh, okay, like I guess I could end up with all these token cards, but no one seemed to really want to play it. And the other thing too is that at the time, it also wasn't one of the top decks. It was played, but it was kind of one of those like, this is my favorite deck, that's why I'm playing it, not a this is the best deck, that's why I'm playing it.
As a perennial fan of Lingering Souls, I can understand why it's not something that everybody would want to do, especially if you have options like Birthing Pod or Scape Shift that you could be doing that represent pretty consistent wins when you can pull them off.
Yeah, exactly. The token decks, the cards seem to be used elsewhere instead of specifically tokens. Like control decks were using the 2 mana make 2 creatures as blockers instead of here's my intangible virtue and here's my sack outlet and here's my blood artist, you know?
Hey, that's one of those things I'm sure all designers struggle with at different points. Like, no, 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 please use this as I intended it.
Yeah, so if it were to really ever get to a more finished state, I mean, I feel like there would still be some cards that could come in or out. Like the current list up on Cube Cobra hasn't changed in a long time because I was working on clones in the background. But Bolt Wave is going to go here in the next finished list, whether I take out black white tokens or not. So I don't need to remove an entire archetype to add new cards, but sometimes there will be a new card that gets printed like Bolt Wave, and that's going in there. So I would say, if I do something drastic, it's definitely not finished. If I don't do something drastic, it's mostly finished. 90 something percent of the way.
Jabs, what advice would you offer to other designers as you consider your work on Modern Darlings, as you think about some of the other projects you're working on? What would you share from that with other people?
So the first thing I would say is to really like know your audience. For me, with this specifically, I really wanted to hit on the nostalgia factor of the players that loved this old modern format. And so I did the best I could. It's not 100%, but I did the best I could to include these older printings, original printings of the cards, or the versions that were the most recognizable or the most common from that time frame. The second thing I would say is to really not be afraid to talk to anybody. Everyone's going to have feedback, everyone's going to have ideas. Whether they're good or bad, you take them all into account and then you digest them for yourself. I've gotten a chance to talk to so many great cube designers and so many great magic players, and the best ideas can come from where you least expect them. And really, that's the beauty of it, right?
There's such a great wisdom in chewing those ideas and not just accepting them all at face value. I know I've talked to other folks about feedback giving and receiving, but that's such a core part of it is embracing it and then rolling with it.
Yeah, I had an original list of this that didn't have the newer cons fetches in it. I had 4 of each Zendikar fetch, and all it took was somebody going, "Well, it felt weird to have to include an off-color shockland just to make my fetch better." And then it clicked in my brain like, oh, I played modern with the cons fetches. Why don't I just include those? And it was just someone that played it one time.
It's easy to get a little bit, I guess nowadays you would say lost in the sauce, with
Yeah,
like looking at the lists and it's like, well, this is how it was, so this would make sense now, but
right.
it doesn't have to be that logged in.
Right, exactly. Even if you're trying to make a time capsule, even if you're trying to recreate something, you can use a little bit of discretion. You can have some wiggle room in the rules that you set for yourself. I guess as a last piece of advice, utilize the amazing resources that we have, Scryfall, Cube Cobra, Moxfield, everything, right? And no idea is actually a bad idea until you prove it's a bad idea. So be a little bit forgiving for yourself and save those old quote unquote bad ideas because you don't know when a new card or any type of support is going to be printed to help out that idea and make it a good idea. Every set or every new release brings new potential for your good or bad ideas. So never stop iterating and never forget those ideas exist.
One of my good friends would always say that he'd refer to cards like Mox Opal and say, "It is the worst right now that it will ever be." So each new set adds something that it can add to and be better for.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of value to it. I have other cubes that I would love specific color pairs to have a little bit more of an identity for, but it's okay if it's like halfway there because I saved that idea until something gets printed.
Its time will come.
Exactly.
Well, Jabs, as we are turning toward wrapping up here, if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you pick and who would you have do the illustration?
So this is a tough one in terms of a lot of aspects because my favorite card ever is Cryptic Command, and the Magic Player Rewards, the full art, the text list, all foil. That version of me is just perfection. It's why I have it as the cover photo for this cube, for example. And I feel like there are so many good Magic artists out there. I couldn't just pick one, but I guess since Wayne England made the favorite version of my favorite card, I would go to them. And whether it would turn out as a likeness of me or whether it would turn out as something else that represented me in a different way, not sure. I think if someone can make something that I consider to be my favorite art in all of Magic, I think I'm going to leave it up to them on how they want to do things.
I love it. Well, Jabs, this has been a delight for me, and I love unpacking this project with you. If folks want to see where the Modern Darlings currently exists, or maybe any progress you've made on the special packs, or any of your other projects, where should we point them?
Yeah, so my Cube Cobra link has a couple of my other cubes that might not be as fleshed out, might not be as polished, but they're there. The ideas are there. Maybe it inspires somebody. Maybe somebody wants to leave me a comment and say, hey, what do you think about this? And you might spark something for me. I don't know. So yeah, Modern Darlings is on Cube Cobra. A couple of my other ideas. I'm really excited about another cube I call the Cycle Cube, which isn't totally finished yet, but every time we get a new set, every time we get a new 5 card cycle, I take it into account for this cube.
Ooh, that's fun. So built on complete cycles of cards.
Yep,
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to share this with us, for sharing your expertise on it, and looking forward to where the cube goes in the future.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited. I wasn't able to make QCon 2024, but it was supposed to be featured there. So I have a feeling that for 2025, wherever this would be featured, it's going to look a little bit different than the current list on online, but if it is featured somewhere and it's announced, I will have that updated list for everyone to test or pick apart in any way that you so choose.
Excellent. Well, fingers crossed, and we'll see you there.
Yeah, definitely excited to get back into the swing of things and do more designing and more cubing.